Hello all, welcome you to the course on corporate laws and governance. In this video, we are going to look at the corporate governance in developed, transition and emerging market economies. Before we look at the corporate governance scenario in these three economies, let's understand what is a transition economy and what is an emerging market economy. Transition economy is that economy wherein they were actually under the state controlled mechanism and they are actually moving from the state controlled mechanism to the market based mechanism as such. So these kinds of economies are called as transition economies. When we look at the emerging market economies, these are all the economies which are actually moving from the developing state to the developed state. They are moving towards the developed economy status as such. So in this particular video, we would be looking at how the corporate governance scenario is in all these three economies, namely the developed economies, transition economies, as well as the emerging market economies. So the discussions that we are going to have, it is going to be based on a research paper on corporate governance in emerging market, a survey which got published in the year 2012. If we look at this particular research paper, the researchers, the authors of this paper have analyzed the corporate governance scenario in developed countries, emerging economies as well as transition economies. They have taken into consideration the data from 23 developed economies, 37 emerging economies and 12 transition economies. If we look at the data that they have collected, the period of study, it is from 2000 to 2010. Whatever the data that they have taken in order to understand the corporate governance scenario, it was for the period of 10 years, that is from 2000 to 2010. So first let's look at how the corporate governance scenario with respect to the diversity in economic and financial environments. If we look at the foreign direct investment, what the analysis of this particular research paper reveals is that the transition and emerging economies are less dependent on the foreign direct investment, and the developed economies are more dependent on the foreign direct investments. When we look at the gross domestic product growth in the period of study, that is from 2000 to 2010, actually it was higher, the GDP growth was higher in transition and emerging economies than that of the developed economies. If we look at the GDP per capita income, the GDP per capita income was way much higher in developed economies than in the case of transition and emerging market economies, though the growth of GDP was higher in the period of study for the transition economies as well as the emerging economies. But if we look at the GDP per capita income, the GDP per capita income was very high in the case of developed economies than that of the transition economies as well as the emerging economies. If we look at the financial system, the financial system is very much diversified, very strong. If we look at the researchers have used ratios in order to calculate the strength of the financial system, and the ratios revealed that the developed economies is 2 times better than that of the emerging market economies, and it was 3 times better than that of the transition economies with respect to the strength of the financial system. And with respect to the stock market, there were inefficiencies in the allocation of resources in the stock market in the case of transition economies. These were the findings with respect to the diversity in economic and financial environments. Next, let's look at the diversity in the institutional environment. This institutional environment is getting looked at from the perspective of creditors' rights as well as the shareholders' rights. If we look at the creditors' right, actually it was well defined in all the three economies, namely the emerging economies, transition economies, as well as the developed economies. All the three economies have well defined creditors' right. When we say well defined creditors' right, that means they have a very good law in place with respect to the creditors' right. But when we look at the shareholders' right, actually this shareholders' rights were not well defined, or were not that much well defined in the transition economies in comparison with the developed and the emerging economies. When we look at the efficiency of the enforcement of the legal rights, the developed economies was way too better than the developing, in the sense the transition economies as well as the emerging economies. So there were inefficiencies in the enforcement of legal rights in the case of the transition and the emerging economies in comparison to the developed economies, which was 2 times better than the transition economies as well as the emerging economies. So when we look at the state of corruption, the state of corruption was very high in the case of the transition economies as well as the emerging economies, and it was actually way better in the case of the developed economies. When we look at the overall disclosure regime and the transparency of matters specifically related to the corporate governance, for this analysis, the researchers haven't taken into account the transition economies. They have made the analysis for the emerging economies as well as the developed economies. Though there is a disclosure mechanism which is in place both in the case of the developed economies as well as in the case of emerging economies. Actually, the variability is there in the emerging economies. It was better in the case of the developed economies than in the case of the emerging economies. Next, let's look at the diversity in the ownership structures. When we look at the diversity in the ownership structure can be divided into two. One is the diffused ownership, another is the concentrated ownership. When we look at this diffused ownership means here the companies are owned by large number of small shareholders. If that is the case, no single shareholder can actually dominate a particular company as such, and the ownership is pretty diversified. It is very widespread in nature. When this ownership is going to be widespread in nature, what happens? This leads to agency problem. What is this agency problem? Agency problem is the problem that would arise between the owners of the company, who are the shareholders, are obviously the owners of the company, and the managers of the company. Normally, these managers would be working for their benefits. They would be ensuring that they get better pay, they get better benefits. So they would be, whenever they take decisions in the company, they will always keep in mind the benefits and the other welfares that they could be getting out of their decisions. So, but the shareholders would be looking for maximizing their wealth. So there is always a rift between the managers and the owners of the company, and these managers are supposed to be the agents of the company, and these owners are the principal of the company. So here the owners or the shareholders should always be monitoring whether these managers are working for their welfare. So that is one of the issues that would happen when you have this diffused ownership. But the advantage of this diffused ownership is that the external market would be very, very developed in nature. The shares would be highly liquid in the stock market. The reason being, it is getting traded continuously in the stock market as the ownership is widespread in nature. So that is the advantage that we have with respect to diffused ownership. If you look at the United States of America, United Kingdom, in all these places we can see diffused ownership structure. They are obviously developed economies. We also have one more ownership structure which is called as concentrated ownership structure. In the case of concentrated ownership structure, what happens? The company's shares would be controlled by few of the shareholders. It could be the promoter, it could be the founders who actually founded the company. So it could be financial institution or an insurance company or a bank. So they would be having major portion of the shareholding as such, and they would be controlling the entire company. So the advantage, if at all we look at the advantage here, we do not have the agency problem, for the reason you have few shareholders who have major shareholding, and the shareholder could be the promoter, it could be the financial institution, insurance company or a bank company. Whatever be the case, they would be having complete control over the company's affairs, and there might not be the separation of ownership from management. They would be in fact taking care of the day-to-day activities of the business. As such, we do not have the agency problem in this particular case, but the problem that we would be having is to do with protecting the minority shareholders, right? So there is you have minority shareholders who do not have a say in the company's matter, because the company would be dominated by this majority shareholders. Somewhere down the line, these minority shareholders' rights have to be protected when we have a concentrated ownership structure. Another one advantage that we may have is that takeover will not be possible, for the reason the stocks would be illiquid in the stock market. It won't be widely traded in the stock market, as it is held by few of the shareholders who will not be trading that in the stock market. So if we look at the stock market, it would be highly illiquid. So the possibility of takeover would be relatively lesser in the case of the concentrated ownership. So that could be told as the advantage, but the problem is protecting the minority shareholders, right? That is a big challenge. And if we look at the countries like Germany, Japan, we do have this particular structure, concentrated ownership structure. So related to this concentrated and diffused ownership structure, we talk about diversity in group affiliation. What is this diversity in group affiliation? It is to do with whether the company is internally controlled or externally controlled. If it is internally controlled, where we have the concentrated ownership, what happens? The external markets like the stock market, bond market will not be actually very vibrant. It will not be developed, for the reason the companies are not dependent on the stock market for raising money, and they are getting loans from the financial institutions or insurance company or the promoters who would be contributing the maximum amount in the company. As such, though they are listed, they are not actually dependent, and their stocks are not highly traded in the stock market. As a result of which, if we look at the external financial market, it would be underdeveloped in the case of concentrated ownership, but it would be other way around in the case of diffused ownership. Wherever we have diffused ownership, there would be more dependence on the external market, where we talk about the capital market or the money market for that matter. That would be vibrant, that would be more developed, as the companies would be dependent on these markets for their financing. Next, let's look at the importance of corporate governance. Why corporate governance is important to a company? Because whenever now we all know globalization is very much the entire world has become a village, and globalization, because of globalization, people corporates have started their business in different countries, and they are raising money from different countries as such. So if at all they want to be attractive to the foreign investors, so when they are going to have a good corporate governance structure, it would be easy for them to raise money both internally within the country as well as from the foreign investors. So this acts as a leverage. When the corporate governance is in place in a particular company, it becomes easy for the company to raise money both from the investors within the country as well as from the investors outside the country. Whenever a company follows good corporate governance, what happens? The valuation that it gets also goes up. When the valuation of the company becomes higher and higher, they can raise money at a cheaper cost. So the cost of capital will come down, which is definitely a boon to the companies. The next is that when a company has a good corporate governance practices in place, so automatically they will be allocating their resources efficiently. They will have better management when they have good efficient allocation of resources. When they have effective management, automatically their operational performance go up, their profitability go up. So their valuation in the market also goes up. The possibility of a company failing comes down drastically when the corporate governance practices are in place for a particular company, because they would be maintaining transparency, they would be ensuring that there is a system of accountability in place in the company, and they would be applying fairness in all their decisions. Because of all these things, the possibility of a company failing comes down drastically. Not only that, when a company is going to have a good corporate governance policies, they will be maintaining good relationship not only with their shareholders but also with all the other stakeholders like the employees, suppliers, distributors, the general public. So when they are going to maintain good relationship with all the stakeholders, they are going to help the economy to go up, in the sense somewhere down the line they are going to contribute to reduce the inequality in the economy, because they are going to provide, they are going to contribute to increase the GDP. So the income level of the economy will go up, so the poverty will go down, the per capita income will increase. Somewhere down the line they are working for removing the inequalities in the society. Not only that, the corporate governance, they will also ensure that they follow the environmental norms. So as such, they are going to work towards sustainability, which is good for the entire world. So these are all the importance of corporate governance. Next, let's look at the models of corporate governance. We are going to look at three models of corporate governance. One is the Anglo-Saxon model, another is the continental model, and the third one is the Japanese model. First, let's look at the Anglo-Saxon model. Anglo-Saxon model means we talk about the United States of America and the United Kingdom. If we look at this Anglo-Saxon model of corporate governance, they are actually following the shareholders model. The other term that we can use for the Anglo-Saxon model is the shareholders model. So though it is very closer to stewardship model or political model, or for that matter stakeholders model, Anglo-Saxon model is very much the shareholders model, where the concentration is on maximizing the shareholders' interest. Whatever decisions that the company takes, they would always keep in mind that it maximizes the wealth of the shareholders. So basically, this kind of model is getting followed by United States of America and United Kingdom. If this particular model advocates for the separation of the chairman from the chief executive officer, in fact, we all know all the corporate governance codes, they talk about separation of the chairman from the chief executive officer. So the chairman should not act as the chief executive officer also. Somewhere down the line, there should be demarcation between the management and the board of directors. So when this happens, the agency problem would be reduced drastically, and the decisions, the chairman will have more time in checking whether the management is actually working towards the strategic goals of the organization. So separation of chairman from the chief executive officer is one of the things which this particular model advocates. So this model also looks for a very good communication among the board, company management and the shareholders, because management is answerable to the board and the board is answerable to the shareholders. So there should be proper communication among all these three segments of people for the efficient functioning of the company. So if we look at the kind of ownership structure this Anglo-Saxon model follows, this follows dispersed ownership structure where no single shareholder can dominate. You do not have major shareholders who would be taking a call on everything. So we do have agency problem here. There are and the stock market would be highly liquid in the case of dispersed ownership structure. Yes, so that is so this kind of ownership structure that exists for this Anglo-Saxon model is the dispersed ownership structure. The next what we are going to look at is the continental model. Continental model means we talk about European countries. European countries follow this continental model. In this continental model, we talk about there is a two-tier system. What is this two-tier that we are talking about is, one is the supervisory board, another is the management board. Supervisory board would consist of the external people, like we talk about the shareholders, we have the employees, union people, all these bankers, insurance companies, all these people would be there in the supervisory board. And we also have the management board, which would consist of all the inside people like the chief executive officer, chief financial officer, all these key managerial personnel would be making up this management board. If we look at the size of the supervisory board, the size of the supervisory board is getting decided by the regulatory environment that is there in a particular country. So how many people should be there in the supervisory board? It is getting decided by the rules and regulations that are in place in a particular country. But this particular continental model always ensures that the company goals are aligned with the national goals. So all the company are expected to work towards achieving the national goals. So whenever the long-term strategies are formulated for the company, they should always keep in mind that the national interest is kept in mind. And this particular model ensures that it is not only the shareholders. If you look at Anglo-Saxon model, it is about the shareholders. But this particular continental model ensures that the interest of all these stakeholders are taken into consideration. That is why we talk about the supervisory board, where we have the participation not only of the shareholders but also of the union members, employees, banks. So all the stakeholders are given importance in this particular continental model. The kind of ownership structure this particular continental model looks at is the concentrated ownership structure, where we have few people who would be dominating. It could be cross-holding, it could be the promoter who would be holding a major shareholding, or it could be the banks or the insurance company. Next, let's move on to the Japanese model. In the case of Japanese model, they talk about the role of different key personnel like the banks, affiliated entities, major shareholders, management and the government. So it is not only the shareholders, in the sense we do have smaller independent individual shareholders, but they cannot dominate the decision making process. We have people from different backgrounds, like we also have the shareholders, along with that the government, banks, affiliated entities. All these play a major role in the Japanese model. Here we have in the board of directors, we have insiders as well as the kairetsu. Kairetsu means we talk about the external people, the major shareholders, we talk about the banks, insurance companies. All these people are also there. Along with that, we do also have insiders like the key managerial personnel occupying the board of directors. But whenever the external people feel that these insiders are not working as per their expectations, these kairetsu, that means the external people, would be removing the inside people who are not actually performing as per their expectations. But here in this Japanese model, government also plays a role by through their rules and regulations, they control the companies by framing rules and regulations. That way, they do have control over the company. Corporate transparency kind of less in this Japanese model, for the reason we do have key people. Whenever a particular category of key people have control over the company, what happens? They start taking major decisions as such. So the transparency is an issue with respect to the Japanese model. Next, let's move on to the corporate governance and the institutional framework. For discussion on this corporate governance and the institutional framework, we are going to be looking at the OECD's corporate governance fact book, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have already seen about this OECD. The OECD comes out with this corporate governance fact book once in every 2 years. So whatever discussions that we are going to have, we are going to look at the analysis that had been done by OECD. In this particular analysis, OECD has looked at the data of 49 jurisdictions. That means 49 countries' data have been taken into account for analyzing the legal, institutional and the regulatory frameworks for corporate governance. They make a comparison how things are in these 49 jurisdictions or the countries. So we will know like how countries vary, how they are different from one another in the institutional framework. We can understand how it has changed over a period of time. So this corporate governance fact book that we are going to look at, the fact book that got published in the year 2023 by OECD, and for the analysis for this, in this particular fact book 2023, OECD has taken the financial year 2021-2022. So this 1 year period data has been collected for this 49 countries, and they have tried understanding how the regulatory, legal and the institutional framework differ among these 49 countries. So let's look at the analysis. First, let's look at the legal framework. So if we look at the legal framework, what we could understand that 70% of these 49 countries have amended either their company law or their securities law or both, which is good. Like they are actually updating their laws with respect to corporate governance. So the legalities are getting upgraded in 70% of the 49 jurisdiction. So there is updation in the national, 1/3 of the 49 jurisdictions have been updating their national corporate governance code as well as or their equivalent frameworks. They are doing it. So everything is getting updated and upgraded as per the changes that happens in the environment, which is a good sign. And what they found out was that in 6 jurisdiction, which is 12%, they have, if you look at the legal framework with respect to the corporate governance, they follow mixed framework. What is this mixed framework? Is certain codes are mandatory, certain codes are voluntary. When it is voluntary, if the company do not follow that, they do not adhere to those codes, they will have to explain why they did not adhere to the corporate governance code. So because, which we call it as comply or explain. You comply it, you tell that you have complied with those codes. In case you have not complied with the corporate governance code, what you will have to do is you will have to give an explanation why you haven't followed it. So 12% of the jurisdictions have mixed corporate governance framework. That means certain codes are mandatory, certain codes they will have to if they comply, they will say why they will give that information. If they don't comply, they will explain why they couldn't comply with those codes. If you look at the binding rules, binding legal framework. 6% of the 49 jurisdictions follow binding, where it is mandatory for the companies to follow the corporate governance code. That means nearly 3 countries follow this binding legal framework. India is one among them. The other 2 countries are United States of America and China. So China, United States of America as well as India have binding legal framework where it is mandatory for the companies to follow the corporate governance code. It is not binding as well as comply or explain. 82% of the 49 jurisdictions have non-binding, that means it is voluntary code. They have to comply. If they comply, they will report the same. If they don't comply, they will have to give the reason why they couldn't comply with the codes. Next, let's look at the approaches for overseeing the corporate governance codes. So here, if you look at it, there are different approaches. We have mixed approach where we have the public, the oversight is getting done by national authorities with the private sector. There is one more mixed where we do not have private sector. It is in the public sector itself where we have the government authorities with the stock exchanges. That is one more mixed we have. Then we have private association only taking care of the corporate governance code, and we have national authorities only taking care of the corporate governance code. So we have all these categories as such. So 27% of the jurisdictions have mixed, where they have the participation of the private with the government authorities, and overseeing is done by both the private and the public. 27% of the jurisdictions follow that, and 22% of the 49 jurisdictions have only private associations who take care of this corporate, overseeing the corporate governance code. And in 18% of the jurisdictions, only stock exchanges take care of it, and 25% of the jurisdictions have national authorities taking care of the corporate governance code. In fact, it has increased from 17% to 25%. It was 17% in the year 2015. Now it has increased to 25%. If we look at India, it is mixed, but we fall under 8%, where we have the stock exchange. SEBI takes care of it along with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So we fall under that 8%. Next, let's look at the public regulators of corporate governance. So we do have in public regulators who and all participate. We have the Securities Authority, we have Financial Authority, Central Bank, Ministry of Justice, Financial Securities or Securities Authority, and Ministry. Fine. So if you look at Korea is the only country where the Ministry of Justice takes care of the corporate governance. That's the only country where it happens. If we look at India, we have Ministry of Corporate Affairs and SEBI, who takes care of the corporate governance regulations. So we fall again under this 8%. So in 16% of the jurisdiction, the central bank takes care of the corporate governance regulation, and 35% of the jurisdictions, we have the financial authority, who are the public regulators of the corporate governance. In 39% of the 49 countries, the stock market, the security authorities act as the public regulators of the corporate governance. India, we fall under the mixed, where we have Ministry of Corporate Affairs and SEBI, that is Financial Securities Authority and Ministry, who take care of the corporate governance regulation. Next, let's look at the operational independence of the regulators. Here, actually, we are looking at like how they are getting funded. So 51% of the jurisdictions are where the corporate governance, the regulatory authorities, they are all self-funded. They get their funding only through the fees. There is one more self-funding. Here, self-funding happens between two sources. It is not only the fees but also fines. Wherever you have wherever it is mandated, right, where it is compulsory. So here, if a particular company does not comply with it, then they'll have to pay a fine of it. So one of the source of income for them to run these boards is through fines. So there are in 17% of the 49 jurisdiction, these regulators are getting funded by the public, in the sense in every budget funds are allocated to these regulators to run the their office as such. So in 20% of the jurisdiction, it is public funded as well as self. Self means it is through fees and fines, and if it is public funded, then they get the allocation in the country's budget every year. So let's look at how many members are there normally in the corporate governance board. So if you look at it, there is no collegial board in 7 of the countries. They don't have any board at all. So minimum number of members is 2 to 4 members. 9 countries have 2 to 4 members. Austria is the only country where they have only 2 members in their corporate governance board. The maximum is the 11 plus members. 8 countries have 11 plus members in the corporate governance board, and Switzerland is the country which has the maximum number of members in the corporate governance board, which is actually 17. So the 22 countries have 5 to 7 members in their board. So thanks for listening.